Welcome to the next section of Module 5, Communication, Homeostasis and Energy. We're going to be moving now on to animal responses and focusing on neurons. A quick look at our learning objectives will show that the main function of this presentation will be to go through the sensory, relay and motor neurons, having a look at their structure and function. A quick reminder of an overview of the nervous system. The nervous system's job is to detect stimuli. So it's obviously a good idea just to make sure we understand what we mean by this term of stimuli. Basically any change in the external or internal environment, and that can be due to a number of different things. So the stimulus could be a change in light levels, a change in temperature, pressure and so on. And that information is then processed and an appropriate response is triggered off. The nervous system, as I'm sure you all remember, is divided into two sections. We've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system are all the nerves which are supplying the other areas of the body. So these will be the spinal nerves which branch off into all parts of the body. So the nervous system is made up of many cells called neurons, and the correct spelling is up on there, which includes an E at the end. You might see it written down elsewhere without. And the role of this is to transmit electrical signals around the body, and that allows us to respond very quickly to the stimulus. And we've got a picture here which shows us a type of neuron which you're probably familiar with. We'll come back to the main features of this in a moment. We've got a lovely picture there on the left showing a nerve fibre, and what you can see that we've got many axons grouped together in that nerve. So we've got in the middle, you've got a blood supply, but you've also got lots and lots of these axons all grouped together in this nerve fibre. There are three types of neuron, and we can see them in these pictures here. Firstly, we've got a motor neuron, a sensory neuron and a relay neuron, and we can see that two quite detailed pictures of the motor and sensory neuron, and then this rather more sparse picture that we've got there at the bottom, which is our relay. So we'll have a look at these neurons in more detail. The first neuron we're going to look at in more detail is the motor neuron. We have a cell body here on the left, and this is the purple structure you can see, and you can see in the centre we've got the nucleus, which is also labelled. So a little bit about the cell body then. It contains the nucleus, which means therefore that's going to control the activities of the cell, just like it would do in any cell. There's lots of endoplasmic reticulum and large numbers of mitochondria. And the endoplasmic reticulum, of course, is making proteins, of which one of those will be neurotransmitters. And the mitochondria are going to power that process, but also provide energy for a large number of other transports that are going to be going on, particularly in the axon. The cell body is divided very finely into lots of very small endings called dendrites, and that's cytoplasm with cell surface membrane on the outside, and these just provide a large number of places where the cell body can make connections with other neurons. The axon is a long thin strand of cytoplasm which is carrying the impulse away from the cell body, and this can be very long. Of course, axons which are carrying impulses, for example from your toes to your spinal cord, are going to be very long. Some of them could be quite short, but they always carry the impulse in the same direction from the cell body towards the endings, and the axon's going to terminate in these terminals, which in fact will form synapses with other neurons. We've also got the myelin sheath. Now the myelin sheath is an insulating layer surrounding the axon, and it's actually made up of individual cells called Schwann cells, and there are some junctions between those cells, and these are called the nodes of Ranvier. The next neuron is a sensory neuron, and you can see that there are some similarities and there will be some differences. The dendrites that we've got here on the left are similar to the ones that we had on the motor neuron, but they're going to merge together to create one long tube carrying the impulse towards the cell body, and this is called the dendron. The cell body here is now centrally located along the neuron, whereas in the motor neuron it was at one end. And we can see there we've got the nucleus in the centre. The axon is carrying the impulse away from the cell body and is going to terminate in these axon terminals that we had in the motor neuron. So we've actually got some similarities there with the motor neuron. We've also got a myelin sheath, this insulating layer, which are made up of these cells called Schwann cells, and the gaps between them are called the nodes of Ranvier, just in the same way as they were in the motor neuron. And we can see here, lastly, we just show some of the nuclei that belong to the Schwann cells, which are actually encircling the axon. The relay neuron is our third and final type of neuron, and they have all the features that you found in the other ones, but I have to say this is obviously a very simplistic type of diagram. Now, the relay neuron's job is to be an intermediary connecting up quite a lot of different neurons from different parts of the body, so its structure is going to be modified to do that job. So we've got dendrites here at the end, and dendrites joining up together to form a dendron, and that carries the impulse towards the cell body, which is much more centrally located on this diagram. We've also got a nucleus in the centre of the cell body, and leading away from the cell body we have axons, and the axon is carrying the information away from the cell body and is going to terminate in these terminal endings that we would have had in motor and sensory neurons. In most nervous responses, the electrical impulse follows this pathway. So we start off with a receptor. That receptor is then going to be sending information to a sensory neuron. So the receptor could be, for example, something like a taste bud. So that's going to then pick up the information and send that information to the sensory neuron. The neuron is then going to carry it to the relay neuron. And the relay neuron might be taking up lots of information from lots of different sensory neurons and coordinating that information. That's going to be then passed on to a motor neuron, and the motor neuron will then be attached to an effector, and that effector will cause a response to occur. So an effector could be something like a muscle or a gland or an organ that can respond in some way. An example here, we've got the receptor in the skin carrying the impulse, which is being coordinated in the spinal cord, when you've got an interneuron, also referred to as the relay neuron, and it's carrying the information to a muscle. One of the most important features of all neurons is the presence of the myelin sheath. So we'll have a look at this in a little bit more detail. Axons and dendrons of quite a lot of the neurons have this myelin sheath on them, and it's formed by cells called Schwann cells, and this is particularly found in the peripheral nervous system. And what they do is they wrap around the axon to form many layers of this myelin sheath, and you can see that on that diagram there. So you can see what looks like sort of concentric circles, and that's because the myelin sheath has wrapped around it as if it was wrapping, for example, like a ball of wool wrapping around the axon in the centre. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. Get many layers then of this plasma membrane laid down, and this creates the insulating layer. So here we have the axon in the centre, and we can see we've got a Schwann cell which is surrounding the axon. And if we look at the next stage, what we can see is that that cell has now wrapped itself right round and is about to wrap itself round again. So what we can see now is we've actually got not just one layer of cells surrounding the axon, we've got a couple of layers of the cell, and this process carries on until eventually you end up with many layers of this cell. So really what we can think of it is a bit like these Schwann cells are a little bit like pavement epithelium, very flattened cells, and they literally wrap themselves around the axon. This shows it quite nicely here in this diagram. And these Schwann cells, each of them have a nucleus, which you can see there. They create these great number of layers surrounding the axon. And the other thing that's very important about them is that they produce this fatty material called myelin. And myelin is mostly a type of lipid. It has a bit of protein with it as well. And it creates this insulating effect. The myelin sheaths also make the axons look very white. And this is why you quite often talk about the white matter in the spinal cord. And sometimes you hear about people talking about the grey matter. And if we look at this slide here, we can see that we have both white and grey matter in the spinal cord and the brain, so in the central nervous system. So what we can see is wherever we've got white matter, this is because these are the neurons which have a lot of myelin on them, whereas some of the neurons that we've got here in the central nervous system don't have myelin sheaths, and these ones are what we refer to as the grey matter. And they often refer to, if you can see on this diagram of the brain, you can see that quite a lot of the grey matter on the brain is in the cortex, which is the outer region of the brain. And we'll see why that is shortly. I like this picture because it just shows quite nicely how these cells are wrapping themselves around the axon in the middle. There's a lot of technical terms on here which you don't really need to know, but this word oligodendrocyte is really just another name for a Schwann cell. So when we have myelinated neurons, the myelin is acting as an insulating layer, and what it does is it allows the impulse to be transferred along the axon a lot faster than it would do if the neuron was unmyelinated. So for example, a myelinated neuron will transmit an impulse perhaps 100 meters per second, whereas a non-myelinated neuron might transmit it only maybe 1 to 2 meters per second. Now the reason for this is because that between each of the Schwann cells you have gaps, and these gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier, so they exist between 1 to 3 millimeters apart. And what happens is that the nerve impulse is going to leap from one node to the other, so that it literally goes through the gap between the two cells, and that therefore, rather than the impulse travelling in like a wave along the axon, the impulse is literally leaping down the axon from node to node, and that allows the impulse to be a lot faster. So the advantages and disadvantages, or really the advantages of myelination. So myelination then can travel much faster. So it was mentioned there about the speeds already. Neurons could be up to 1 meter long. So in myelinated neurons, that makes the movement of the impulse really a massive advantage. So in unmyelinated neurons, because the impulse is taking a lot longer to transfer along the nerve, it's fine if the neuron distance is quite short. So for example, the transfer of an impulse from one neuron in the brain to another neuron in the brain doesn't have to be particularly quick because they're so close together, so they don't have to be myelinated. Myelinated neurons are particularly common where you have nerves involved in movement. So for example, a motor neuron carrying an impulse to your muscles, so that will need to be quite quick. You've made the decision, you expect it to happen, you don't expect to have to wait for your brain to tell your arm to move and then your arm to move. Unmyelinated ones tend to be involved with functions which are more to do with coordination, and they don't have to be quite so fast because these ones are being controlled with a little bit more sort of planning, really, I suppose. Now this brings me on to a disease called multiple sclerosis. It's a very unfortunate disease. It's degenerative, it's a chronic condition which gradually causes the person to become more and more unwell. It's also known to be an autoimmune disease. Now, the evidence is that the immune system of somebody that suffers from this is attacking its own nervous system, and particularly destroying the myelin sheath. There seems to be an overproduction of cytokines, which, as you know, are involved in signalling towards the lymphocytes to get involved in the immune response, and this then leads to inflammation. And though there isn't absolutely definite understanding of this, the reasons what triggers this or anything like that, they do realise that this is the process that's involved, but at the moment it's not really sure why it's triggered in some people and not in others. But that is quite often the problem with a lot of autoimmune diseases, and even things like allergies. We don't really understand why the immune system doesn't respond the same for everybody. The symptoms of multiple sclerosis vary quite a lot depending upon the person, and also depending upon the other conditions around them. I have heard some quite interesting research in recent years suggesting that the diet that you have can actually slow down the progress of multiple sclerosis. We've got some pictures here which show you what a normal nerve fibre would look like with healthy myelin sheaths, and then you can see what happens to the myelin sheath with multiple sclerosis. You get degeneration of the Schwann cell. People who suffer from multiple sclerosis can have a range of symptoms. The disease itself, its progress varies quite a lot from person to person. Some people have periods where the disease seems to be quite bad, and then the disease seems to sort of go away and they feel a lot better. Other people have a much more sort of steady progression of symptoms, and quite often the sorts of symptoms you'd expect to find could be physical, but it can affect the people's mental and psychiatric health as well. But the sorts of things that you would often commonly see with someone with multiple sclerosis would be things like maybe distorted vision, so they might have double vision. They could develop blindness in one or both eyes. So obviously the nervous system is providing quite a lot of nerves towards the eyesight. So any sort of any damage to those nerves will result in permanent distortion of eyesight, which is obviously quite upsetting for people in that situation. Most commonly people identify multiple sclerosis because they are noticing things like numbness, so they don't necessarily notice things like, you know, they touch their leg and they can't feel it, that type of thing. Or they might have problems with coordinating their movements. Some people find, for example, that they feel weak, or they struggle to walk and that type of thing, and something which hasn't happened before, and that would be an indication that something isn't quite right. And of course, once they suffer from some of these symptoms, when you get it checked out, then the doctors can try to identify if there's anything more serious going on. So having just a quick look at a couple of questions: state the difference between the function of a motor and a sensory neurone for 1 mark. Draw and annotate a diagram of a motor neurone, and describe the difference in structure between a myelinated and non-myelinated neuron and how this affects the speed of nerve impulse transmission. So the difference between the function of a motor and a sensory neurone. Sensory neurons transmit impulses to the central nervous system from a receptor. Motor neurons transmit the impulses away from the central nervous system to an effector. Draw and annotate a diagram of a motor neuron. This would be worth maybe 4 marks. 1 mark would be for things like a correctly drawn and labelled structures like dendrites, drawn as multiple short protrusions from the cell body. The cell body containing a nucleus for 1 mark. The long single axon for 1 mark. And a myelin sheath with nodes of Ranvier for 1 mark. And describe the difference in structure between a myelinated and a non-myelinated neuron and how this affects the speed a nerve impulse is transmitted. So any 4 from axon of a myelinated neuron is covered in myelin. Myelin is an electrical insulator. The sheath is formed by Schwann cells growing around the axon several times. There are gaps in the myelin sheath nodes known as the nodes of Ranvier. And the electrical impulse moves in a series of jumps from one node to the next, which is known as saltatory conduction. Impulse is transmitted much faster than an unmyelinated neuron. Okay, and this brings us to the end of this presentation, and the next presentation will cover how the impulse is transmitted along a nerve.